right, from one summit to another, because it is time to convene our summit. Let's go. So tonight we are delighted to welcome from Austin, Texas, Ambassador Edmund Fitton-Brown, the Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, former British Ambassador to Yemen. From Florida, Dr. Eric Mandel, Founder and Director of the Middle East Political Information Network, and from London, ex-diplomat, geopolitical expert, podcaster, Pyotr Kurzin. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for joining us tonight, because we want to ask who's on board. Trump's board of peace, bold new world realpolitik, or simply the funeral of post-World War II global order? Before we discuss, let's take a closer look.
For nearly 80 years, the United Nations has been the backbone of global diplomacy, but today its relevance is under intense debate. Supporters argue the UN still matters. It delivers humanitarian aid, coordinates global health responses, and provides a rare forum where rivals talk instead of fight. Even critics admit, without it, many crises would likely be worse. But critics say the system is fundamentally broken. The Security Council reflects the power balance of 1945, not today. 5 countries hold veto power, often blocking action on wars, atrocities, and sanctions, leaving the UN paralyzed when it's needed most. So can it still be reformed? Ideas range from expanding the Security Council to limiting veto use in humanitarian crises. But any meaningful change requires approval from the very powers that benefit most from the status quo, which raises the bigger question: is it already too late to reform the international body, or is building an alternative now the only viable path forward?
All right, gentlemen, as always, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. Simply put, can the UN be reformed? Ambassador Fitton-Brown, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. I would say the UN has to be reformed. I don't think there's an option for either the United States withdrawing from it or for abolishing it. And I don't think it would be possible in the present polarized world we live in to recreate something like the United Nations. So for all of its imperfections, I think we have no choice but to embark on a determined course of action to reform it.
All right. Dr. Mandel, your take.
Thank you for having me, Ellie. Yes, if it is repurposed with lowered expectations, the question is, can the UN overcome its perception of illegitimacy, and whether abandoning institutional bodies, makes the world safer or more chaotic? If the Americans withdraw, it increases the influence of our adversaries, the Chinese and Russians. But unless there's reform, ending the politicized committees that target Israel, the Human Rights Committee, or reforming UNESCO, which delegitimizes the Jewish connection to Israel, it's going to remain a joke.
All right, last but not least, Mr. Kurzin, your take.
Thank you. I think it's already been sort of alluded to, but it's not mutually exclusive that we see an end to the international order as it is, and the UN somehow has to go with it. You can have both together occurring. And the UN there is nothing else that could do what the UN does in Afghanistan. Who was left to engage the Taliban when everyone withdrew? Who would oversee such things as the law of the sea? And sure, you can leave it, but that doesn't mean it's not going to still exist with the Chinese and Indians, most of all, influencing it.
All right, gentlemen, let's please feel free to engage in the conversation from this point onwards. So we keep on trash talking the UN quite often. Very easy target, if I may. But maybe it's not necessarily the institution that lost its moral ground, but reality that outgrew it to an extent, Dr. Mandel.
Well, it's a little bit of anachronism because it, occurred in a time when it was created after World War II by the majority of the nations being democracies. Today, you see 190 plus nations, the vast majority authoritarian, anti-Western, anti-American. Having said that, it does have functioning bodies that are very important of the international institutions. The World Bank is very important, the International Monetary Fund, helping with human disasters. And even when the General Assembly occurs in New York City, besides the traffic that it creates, it gives the chance for leaders to show up and talk behind the scenes with one another where they wouldn't have that opportunity. And look, it just passed the Trump peace plan. So things do get accomplished. But it is a disaster for things like UNIFIL, didn't stop the chemical weapons in Syria, and it ignores most human rights abuses throughout the world in China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and disproportionately focuses on Israel.
But Ambassador Fitton Brown, is it even possible to begin and reform such a big, complicated body at this point in time?
It's really difficult. And of course, I very much agree with what was just said. I thought that was an excellent exposition. We should mention the Secretary General. He's been a particularly bad and ineffective Secretary General. We're about to have a change of Secretary General, and unfortunately, the signs are that the candidates to replace him may not be very much better, although I think they genuinely could not be worse than. In terms of reform, I think that the way that we have to go at this is going to be led by the United States in a budgetary context. It's going to be about freezing money until the UN does what it has started to do, which is to make some quite serious cuts. Now, that's not a great way of designing a body, but it should lead to the lopping off of some particularly unwelcome limbs.
Mr. Kurzin, maybe it's just healthy competition in a very American-style way of seeing things. Maybe a new body will invigorate the old one that will simply have to adapt and adjust or else become finally redundant.
The same amount of competition that BRICS is offering it, does it? The border peace is made up of about, what, 20 to 30 nations, and which of those, other than the United States, really carries any international influence? And that's not to disbar them. They're important. I have been to many of the nations on the list, but unfortunately, they don't carry the same political and strategic weight. And my point is that unless you have greater adoption or admission to the border peace, then it doesn't necessarily give it legitimacy. The reason the UN exists and is relevant is because countries give it agency and legitimacy. And that's probably one of the core emphases of my entire perspective. A country becomes a country, not because it has a bank or a currency or territory. It's because other countries give it that recognition. It's that intrinsic value. And so the border peace certainly can grow, but it also becomes a problem, which is, and then I'll pass back to you with this last point, which is simply that BRICS, we've seen what begins to happen when it becomes bigger. It becomes bloated, you get greater disagreements, and ultimately that's what would happen to the border peace. So none of the issues that the UN has right now would suddenly not exist with a bigger border peace. The UN can be reformed, it's just about the political will.
So what, was the dream of global governance always an illusion to an extent?
Yes, I think so. Well, I don't know. Sorry, I don't know if that's not very debate of me. Sorry about that.
Can I just offer a quick perspective?
Of course.
One of the things we haven't talked about, for example, is the work that the United Nations does supporting global counterterrorism. And this is only a tiny thing. I don't want to pretend that this justifies all of the bloat or all of the inefficiency and the corruption that exists in the UN. But it's a good example of where you have tasks that are supranational, and each leading nation, whether that's the United States or someone else, struggles to be to hold the ring on it. You then bring in the UN. It creates the kind of consultancy, the kind of advice, and the kind of incentives and indeed imperatives through Security Council resolutions that actually leads globally to a real uplift in international counterterrorism capability. So that's an example of governance where the UN actually hasn't done a bad job.
So, and if I could just tag on to that from the ambassador, like the point about Afghanistan, I think is critical here, because when the US-led coalition withdrew, there was nobody willing to engage the Taliban because no legitimate country wants to be seen as the first to, well, engage the Taliban, right? Not even the Russians or the Chinese. This is obviously beginning to change now with current circumstances. But the only entity that existed with the reasonable capacity as well was the UN. And you've got 25+ million people, I can't remember the exact population figures, who are in dire need of humanitarian aid and support. And therefore the UN goes in. And I can also say from my experience in Africa, like the UN is really the only body with that global reach. It depends on much funding and, of course, again, political will. But Ethiopia, DRC, all of the conflicts that are ongoing in Africa exist. And ironically, the biggest upholders of the idea of the UN Charter are the countries that came out of decolonization, the African states, because they understood and understand that they have to deal with the hand that they've been given, manage the territorial integrity, the sovereignty. And they're some of the staunchest. We've seen the comments from Kenya towards Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example.
And yet, if I may, it reminds me of this bit by the legendary, brilliant Israeli satire writer, Ephraim Kishon, who had this story about a lion running away from the zoo and then walking into one of the main government offices and eats one clerk, goes to bed. The second day he comes and eats another clerk, goes to bed. The third day, the fourth day he eats the woman who hands out tea, and then in 10 minutes they called police. So no one realized the lion went off, is missing from the zoo, and no one felt those clerks are missing as well. Only when those who actually do things went away, then someone realized there's something. So if the UN institutions per se are gone tomorrow, will we feel the difference?
Well, I just wanted to jump in.
We already do.
Because my world is primarily the Middle East and U.S. relations in the Middle East. And it has been a terrible history of the United Nations in the Middle East. If you look at what's going on in UNIFIL right now, basically in Lebanon, they've if anything, they've protected Hezbollah. They haven't done their mission. You can go back to 1967 when the UN basically abandoned where they were supposed to be and let the Egyptians close the Straits of Tiran. So you have a situation, we have to ask ourselves, what was the UN's purpose? It was to promote peace after World War II, protect civilians, universal human rights, prevent war, manage conflicts, and coordinate cooperations. And it has done a very bad job about that. So maybe the hybrid that we should have is not the Board of Peace alone, not the UN alone, but maybe we want a coalition of willing democracies and maybe build upon it so there is not an abandonment after a mission is completed. It doesn't have to be the set that we have right now. Keep what's good. I think the IMF, the World Bank, and things that aren't so good, I think they need to be defunded. And really, that's the only currency that the United States has.
Ambassador Fitton-Brown, I can see that you're in agreement here. And maybe this is the zeitgeist to an extent, not the bug, but the feature, so to speak. We see regional blocs, let it be the Arab League or ASEAN, and all those, maybe they sometimes move much faster than the UN. Maybe the world is fragmenting into regions, and it is not performing by reason.
I mean, I think that's a fair point. And regional blocs certainly have their place, but you will always find that they want to work with some kind of international ring holder. And I think this point that our colleague was making about Afghanistan is really important. I'd like to underline that. There are so many orphan issues in the world. If they're not orphan issues, they're supranational, and nobody's willing to sort of take them on as their main responsibility. One moment when I concluded that the United Nations, for all its faults, was really necessary was when Yemen fell into chaos. And a little bit like Afghanistan, nobody really wanted to own it. But you end up with a sort of a combination of the concerned states. Now, that might be in the case of Yemen, that was often the Saudis, the Emiratis, the United States. Yeah. In the case of Afghanistan, it might be the neighboring countries. You might be talking about Tajikistan and China and Pakistan or something of that kind, but always working with some international validation, because the danger with regional blocs can't replace the UN. if you were to replace the UN, you'd have to design something like it. And as I said earlier, in the present polarized world that we have, you could not reach agreement on what that should look like. And the Board of Peace, I think, is not going to succeed in that area. We can already say, of course, that the Security Council played ball with the Board of Peace. It passed the resolution to support the role of the Board of Peace. But the Board of Peace has already moved on to a very different model from what was envisaged at that time, and which, of course, is far beyond what was approved by the Security Council.
And if I can just again add to that, I think that ultimately it's about agency, and the Board of Peace is seen as a bit of a joke by some of the biggest players that are going to be growing. Right, one of the core critiques of issues with the UN is the Security Council. When we talk about the UN, we often talk about just the Security Council, and people who don't work in it or study it don't understand how complex the UN is. And the Security Council is grossly unrepresentative of the international community now. The British and the French are not the powers that they were, and the country Japan
and systemically paralyzed.
Yes, it is paralyzed, and there's nothing you can do to change it, because for you to change the Security Council requires the Security Council. So it's a bit of a ridiculous situation. So ultimately, what I can envisage to an extent is that the UN is more streamlined. I think a simpler, smaller entity that focuses on data collection, administrative elements, humanitarian provision through specific means, working with the African Union, with the Middle East, Arab League, for example, or ASEAN. The UN has been incredibly important for Myanmar. I think this is where it goes. But again, it's about political.
Jump in, Ellie?
Dr. Mandel, please. Yes, of course.
Yeah. First of all, I agree about the streamlining and repurposing it, but I think it's unfair to call the Board of Peace what has evolved to, but we're dealing with something that really its primary purpose is regarding the Gaza Executive Board and the Technocratic Board and these and the International Stabilization Force that's going to come. And I have to say, without the American leadership here, you would not have basically a ceasefire now. You would not have all the living hostages back. Israel will not be controlling 59% of the yellow zone. Without American taking the lead here, and whether you call it the Board of Peace or not, I can't call it, I really think it's totally unfair to call it a joke, because it has some real accomplishments here, however you phrase it. The greater idea of a Board of Peace that has many that maybe people think is replaced in the UN is a different story. But its first mission has gotten off actually much better than expected. What will happen next, I don't know, but certainly better than anything the UN has done.
Well, I know what will happen next. We're taking a very short break, but when we get back, we dive in deeper into the prospects of this Board of Peace to actually succeed. And you all, gentlemen, are well-versed with what is happening here in the Middle East. And as the first test case, this is also very important. So a very quick break. We'll be right back.